On the morning of June the 4th, 1943, Kapitänleutnant Peter-Erich Cremer stood in the conning tower of U-333 scanning the horizon through his Zeiss binoculars. The North Atlantic stretched empty in every direction. Grey water, grey sky, no ships visible. His hydrophone operator had detected distant propeller sounds 20 minutes earlier, but Cremer couldn't see anything. That wasn't unusual. Convoys often appeared on the horizon as smudges of smoke before individual ships became visible. What happened next changed everything Cremer thought he knew about Atlantic warfare. A twin-engine aircraft appeared at low altitude, emerging from cloud cover 3 kilometers away. Cremer's lookouts shouted warnings. The bridge watch scrambled for the hatch. Cremer took one last look through his binoculars before diving. The aircraft was an American Grumman Avenger, torpedo bomber configuration, painted in standard US Navy gray. But it wasn't flying from any land base. They were 800 kilometers from Newfoundland, 1,200 kilometers from Iceland, 1,500 kilometers from Britain. No land-based aircraft had the range to patrol this far into the mid-Atlantic gap. Then Cremer saw it. Behind the aircraft, barely visible on the horizon, was a small aircraft carrier. It was operating alone, no battleships or cruisers escorting it, just a handful of destroyer escorts. The carrier was maybe 10,000 tons, a fraction of the size of fleet carriers Cremer had seen in intelligence briefings. It was steaming directly toward his position. Cremer ordered crash dive. U-333 dropped beneath the surface in 35 seconds. Depth charges exploded above them as they descended past 50 meters. The hull rang like a bell. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained down from the pressure hull. The boat shuddered with each explosion. Cremer counted 8 detonations before the attack ended. When he finally surfaced 4 hours later, the carrier was gone. But Cremer knew what he'd seen. The Americans had brought aircraft carriers into the mid-Atlantic gap. That shouldn't have been possible. Fleet carriers were capital ships worth more than a dozen destroyers. No navy would risk them hunting submarines in open ocean. They were too valuable, too vulnerable. But this carrier had been small, expendable, designed specifically for anti-submarine work. Cremer radioed his report to U-boat headquarters in Paris. He described the carrier, estimated its size and speed, reported the aircraft type. He stated flatly that American escort carriers were now operating in the Central Atlantic. The intelligence staff reviewed his report and filed it with dozens of similar sightings. They'd been receiving reports about small carriers for 3 months. Admiral Dönitz had read the reports. He'd dismissed them as misidentifications or exaggerations. Dönitz believed escort carriers were propaganda. The British and Americans were building them. That much was confirmed through intelligence channels, but they couldn't be effective. Carriers needed speed to launch aircraft. They needed armor to survive combat. They needed size to carry sufficient aircraft and fuel. A small carrier sacrificed all those capabilities. It would be slow, vulnerable, limited in operational range. It might work for coastal convoy escort, but it couldn't hunt submarines in the deep Atlantic. The physics didn't support it. What Dönitz didn't know was that physics supported it perfectly, and by the end of summer 1943, escort carriers would transform Atlantic warfare so completely that U-boat operations would become suicide missions. The escorts would hunt submarines with a coordination and persistence that made evasion impossible. They would turn the hunter into the hunted, and they would do it with technology that was barely 3 years old. The concept of escort carriers emerged from desperation. In March 1941, Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. The critical vulnerability was the mid-Atlantic gap, a zone roughly 1,000 kilometers wide, where land-based aircraft couldn't provide cover. Convoys crossing that gap were defenseless against submarine wolf packs. Churchill had been demanding more aircraft carriers for convoy escort since 1940. The Admiralty explained that fleet carriers couldn't be spared from Mediterranean and Pacific operations. Building new fleet carriers took 3 to 4 years. Britain would lose the war before they were commissioned. Churchill asked if smaller carriers could be built faster. The Admiralty was skeptical, but authorized feasibility studies. The solution came from an unexpected source. Captain Mackenzie Gregory, serving with the naval staff, proposed converting merchant ships into auxiliary carriers. Take a cargo vessel, remove the superstructure, install a flight deck, add minimal aircraft handling equipment. The conversion could be completed in 6 months using existing shipyard capacity. The resulting carrier would be slow, lightly armed, and carry only 15 to 20 aircraft, but it would provide air cover where none existed. The Admiralty approved construction of the first escort carrier, HMS Audacity, in February 1941. She was converted from the captured German merchant ship Hanover, a 5,000-ton freighter. Workers stripped at everything above the main deck, welded steel beams across the hull to support a flight deck, installed a small hangar beneath the deck, added catapult equipment and arresting gear. The entire conversion took 4 months. Audacity was commissioned in June 1941. She displaced 8,000 tons, made 15 knots, maximum speed, carried 8 aircraft, and had no armor protection. Her flight deck was 430 feet long, barely adequate for the Grumman Martlet fighters she carried. She had no island superstructure. Navigation and control were conducted from a small bridge beneath the forward flight deck. She was crude, uncomfortable, and wildly successful. Audacity's first convoy escort mission began in September 1941. She sailed with convoy OG-74 from Liverpool to Gibraltar. Her Martlet fighters detected and drove off Fokker-Wulf Condor reconnaissance aircraft that were shadowing the convoy. Without reconnaissance reports, U-boats couldn't find the convoy. All 39 merchant ships reached Gibraltar without loss. It was the first completely successful convoy, crossing in months. Admiral Dönitz noticed. He read the patrol reports from U-boat commanders who'd been assigned to attack OG-74. They reported being unable to locate the convoy despite favorable weather and good visibility. Reconnaissance aircraft had been driven off by carrier-based fighters. Dönitz concluded that the British had assigned a fleet carrier to convoy escort, an enormous waste of resources, but tactically effective. He noted in his war diary that if the British were desperate enough to use fleet carriers for convoy duty, their situation must be worse than German intelligence estimated. Audacity's second convoy mission in December 1941 ended differently. She escorted convoy HG-76 from Gibraltar to Britain, 32 merchant ships with 17 escorts. Dönitz assigned 9 U-boats to attack the convoy. He'd been waiting for another opportunity to prove that concentrated Wolfpack tactics could overwhelm any defense. The battle lasted 5 days. Audacity's aircraft sank U-131 and forced 3 other submarines to dive. Her fighters shot down 2 Condor reconnaissance aircraft, but on December 21st, U-751 torpedoed Audacity. The escort carrier had no armor and minimal damage control systems. She sank in 15 minutes. 173 crew members died. Dönitz was satisfied. He'd proven that small carriers were vulnerable to submarine attack. The British had lost a valuable asset. His U-boats had sunk 2 merchant ships and the carrier. That was an acceptable exchange ratio. He expected the British to abandon the escort carrier concept. They had proven to be death traps. The British reached the opposite conclusion. Audacity had been sunk, but before going down, her aircraft had protected the convoy so effectively that 30 of 32 merchant ships reached Britain safely. The loss rate was 6%. Normal loss rates for Gibraltar convoys without air cover were running 20 to 30%. Even accounting for Audacity's loss, the convoy had been a strategic success. The Admiralty ordered immediate construction of more escort carriers, but British shipyards were operating at maximum capacity, building destroyers, corvettes, and fleet carriers. There was no available construction berth for auxiliary carriers. Churchill approached President Roosevelt with a direct request. Could American shipyards build escort carriers for the Royal Navy? Roosevelt agreed. In January 1942, the U.S. Maritime Commission awarded contracts to convert 20 merchant hulls into escort carriers. The first would be British-operated under Lend-Lease. The rest would join the U.S. Navy. American shipyards had excess capacity and standardized construction methods. They could build escort carriers faster and cheaper than anyone expected. The American approach was different from British conversions. Instead of converting existing ships, American yards built escort carriers from the keel up using mass production techniques. Kaiser Shipbuilding, which had revolutionized merchant ship construction with prefabrication and welding, applied the same methods to escort carrier production. Hull sections were built inland, transported to the shipyard, and welded together in a matter of weeks. The Bogue-class escort carrier became the standard American design, displacing 9,800 tons, making 18 knots, carrying 24 aircraft. It was larger and more capable than British conversions. The design incorporated lessons from Audacity's loss, better subdivision for damage control, more pumps, improved fire suppression. Bogue-class carriers were still unarmored and vulnerable, but they could survive damage that would have sunk earlier conversions. American production was astonishing. Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard could complete an escort carrier in 3 months from keel laying to commissioning. By mid-1943, the yard was launching one carrier every 2 weeks. The Casablanca class, a slightly improved design, entered production in November 1942. 50 Casablanca-class carriers were built by Kaiser between November 1942 and July 1944, an average of one every 12 days. Total production numbers were staggering. The United States built 122 escort carriers during World War II. Britain built 40. Combined, the Allies commissioned 162 escort carriers, more than all other aircraft carriers built by all nations combined. Most were commissioned between 1942 and 1944. They entered service at exactly the moment when U-boat operations were reaching peak effectiveness. Admiral Dönitz was aware of Allied carrier construction. German intelligence provided regular reports on American shipyard output, but Dönitz believed the carriers were being built for Pacific operations against Japan. The Pacific theater required carriers. Distances were enormous. Land-based air cover was impossible across most of the theater. Escort carriers made sense in that context. Dönitz didn't believe the Allies would waste carriers on Atlantic convoy escort. Atlantic convoys were already protected by destroyers and corvettes. Long-range patrol aircraft from Britain, Iceland, and Newfoundland covered most routes. The only gap was the mid-Atlantic zone, and Dönitz believed that gap would remain uncovered because carriers couldn't operate there effectively. The ocean was too rough. Weather was too severe. A small carrier would be tossed around in North Atlantic storms, unable to launch or recover aircraft. Dönitz's assessment was based on fleet carrier operations. Fleet carriers required relatively calm seas to conduct flight operations. Launching and recovering aircraft in heavy weather was dangerous. Escort carriers, being smaller and less stable, should have been even more limited. The logic was sound. The conclusion was wrong. Escort carriers proved remarkably effective in North Atlantic conditions. Their smaller size made them more maneuverable. Their lighter displacement meant they rode over waves instead of plowing through them. Flight operations were dangerous, but pilots adapted. They learned to time landings between wave crests. They accepted higher accident rates as the price of operational effectiveness. Losses to weather and accidents were significant, but not high enough to prevent operations. The first American escort carrier group deployed to the Atlantic in March 1943. Task Group 21.14, centered on USS Bogue, sailed from Norfolk with orders to hunt U-boats in the mid-Atlantic Gap. The group consisted of Bogue and 4 destroyer escorts. It was designated a hunter-killer group, a new tactical concept that prioritized destroying submarines over protecting convoys. Previous escort doctrine had been defensive. Escorts surrounded convoys and responded to U-boat attacks. Once a submarine was driven off or sunk, escorts returned to the convoy. They didn't pursue. Their mission was to protect merchants, not hunt submarines. Hunter-killer groups inverted that doctrine. They actively searched for U-boats using aircraft, sonar, and radio direction finding. When they detected a submarine, they pursued until it was destroyed. Convoy protection was secondary to submarine destruction. The tactical concept came from Captain Daniel Gallery, one of the most innovative anti-submarine warfare officers in the U.S. Navy. Gallery argued that escorts could never win by playing defense. U-boats chose when and where to attack. They had initiative. Escorts reacted. That dynamic had to be reversed. Hunter-killer groups would take the initiative. They would force U-boats to react, to dive, to evade, to waste time and battery power running from pursuers instead of hunting convoys. Gallery's theories were controversial. Many officers believed escort carriers were too vulnerable to operate offensively. A carrier group hunting submarines was exposed to counterattack if a U-boat sank an escort carrier in open ocean. The loss would be catastrophic. Gallery argued the risk was acceptable. Losing one carrier might save 50 merchant ships. The exchange ratio favored offensive operations. Admiral Royal Ingersoll, commanding U.S. Atlantic Fleet, authorized Gallery's approach. In March 1943, hunter-killer groups were deployed across the North Atlantic. Their mission orders were simple. Find U-boats, sink them, don't wait for convoys to be attacked, go where the submarines are and destroy them. Yes, USS Bogue's first patrol began on March 12, 1943. Captain Giles Short commanded the carrier. He had 24 aircraft aboard, 12 Grumman TBF Avengers, and 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcats. The Avengers carried depth charges and acoustic homing torpedoes. The Wildcats provided fighter cover and could strafe surface submarines. Short's orders directed him to patrol a rectangular box 800 kilometers south of Greenland, right in the middle of the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats concentrated. The first 5 days produced no contacts. Aircraft flew search patterns covering hundreds of square kilometers. They found nothing. Weather was poor. Cloud cover reduced visibility. Radar was relatively primitive, effective only at short ranges. Short began to wonder if the entire concept was flawed. The Atlantic was enormous. U-boats were tiny. Finding them was like searching for needles in an ocean. On March 18th, an Avenger detected a radar contact at 15 kilometers. The pilot descended through clouds and found U-406 on the surface, charging batteries. The U-boat's watch spotted the aircraft and ordered crash dive. The Avenger attacked before the submarine submerged, dropping 4 depth charges. 2 exploded close alongside. U-406 survived the attack, but was forced to abort its patrol and return to base with severe damage. Short was encouraged. His aircraft had detected and attacked a U-boat without any prior intelligence. The radar had worked. The tactics had worked. He sent a radio report to Atlantic Fleet headquarters describing the engagement. Over the next week, Bogue's aircraft attacked 3 more submarines. None were sunk, but all were damaged severely enough to abort patrols. Admiral Dönitz noticed the pattern. Multiple U-boats reported being attacked by carrier aircraft in mid-ocean. The attacks came from small carriers operating with minimal escort. Dönitz reviewed the intelligence assessments. His staff estimated the Americans had committed at least 6 escort carriers to Atlantic operations. That was more than expected, but still manageable. Carriers were detectable. U-boats could evade them or attack them. What Dönitz didn't understand was the operational doctrine. He assumed escort carriers were assigned to specific convoys, providing close air cover, just as Audacity had done. That was the only logical use. A carrier sailing independently, hunting submarines in open ocean, made no tactical sense. It was too vulnerable. A single U-boat with a good firing position could sink it. In reality, escort carriers almost never sailed with convoys. They operated in hunter-killer groups, roaming assigned patrol sectors, searching for submarines with aircraft and radar. The carriers were bait. U-boats that tried to attack them were exposing themselves to counterattack from the screening destroyers. The entire group was a trap designed to force U-boats into engagement on terms that favored the escorts. On April 22, 1943, USS Bogue achieved the first confirmed U-boat kill by an American escort carrier. An Avenger, piloted by Lieutenant William Chamberlain, detected U-175, surfaced, recharging batteries 400 kilometers south of Greenland. Chamberlain attacked immediately, dropping 4 Mark 47 depth charges. At least 2 exploded directly beneath the submarine's pressure hull. U-175's commander, Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Bruns, was on the bridge when the attack came. He ordered, crash dive. But the boat was already doomed. The depth charge explosions ruptured the pressure hull in multiple locations. Seawater flooded into the control room and engine room. The submarine sank stern first in less than 2 minutes. Bruns and 11 crew members were blown clear as the boat went down. 42 men died. The survivors were rescued by Bogue's escorts and taken prisoner. Bruns was interrogated at a facility in Britain. He told interrogators that U-175 had been detected without warning. The aircraft appeared at low altitude before lookouts saw it. His METOX radar warning receiver had given no indication. The attack was so sudden that defensive action was impossible. He'd had no idea a carrier group was operating in the area. The interrogation report reached Allied intelligence within days. It confirmed what analysts suspected. U-boats had no effective warning system against centimetric radar. Aircraft equipped with 10-centimeter ASV Mark III radar could detect surfaced submarines at 15 to 20 kilometers. The submarine's first warning was visual, usually when the aircraft was already within attack range. Escape was impossible. Escort carriers were equipped with the same centimetric radar carried by Coastal Command Patrol aircraft. But carrier-based aircraft had two advantages. First, they operated from mobile platforms. A carrier could position itself near known U-boat concentration areas and maintain continuous air patrols. Land-based aircraft had to fly long distances to patrol areas, limiting time on station. Carrier aircraft could search for hours because they were already in the operational zone. Second, carrier groups weren't bound by fixed routes. Land-based patrol aircraft flew predictable patterns from their bases to patrol sectors and back. Experienced U-boat commanders learned to avoid those patterns. Carrier groups moved randomly, appearing in different locations each day. U-boats never knew where carrier aircraft might patrol. The unpredictability was psychologically devastating. In May 1943, the same month that Dönitz withdrew U-boats from North Atlantic convoy routes, 4 escort carrier groups were operating in the Atlantic: USS Bogue, USS Card, USS Core, and HMS Biter. Between them, they sank 7 U-boats and damaged 18 others. The damaged submarines limped back to French ports with cracked pressure hulls, flooded compartments, destroyed diesel engines. Some would be out of service for months. Several were so badly damaged they were scrapped. Dönitz was facing a crisis. His U-boats were being hunted by forces they couldn't detect or evade. Aircraft appeared without warning. Attacks came from perfect positions. Submarines that survived described their helplessness. They couldn't fight back. Anti-aircraft guns were ineffective against aircraft attacking from optimal angles. The only defense was to dive immediately, but diving meant abandoning the patrol area and running submerged until the threat passed. Battery power became critical. Type 7C submarines, the backbone of the U-boat force, carried batteries sufficient for 60 to 80 hours of submerged operation at economical speed. Every time a submarine dove to evade aircraft, it consumed battery power. If aircraft appeared every few hours, the submarine spent most of its time submerged, unable to charge batteries, unable to reposition, unable to hunt convoys. The operational cycle became untenable. U-boats sailed from French bases, transited the Bay of Biscay under constant air threat, reached patrol areas in the Atlantic, dove repeatedly to evade carrier aircraft, exhausted batteries, surfaced at night to recharge, got attacked again, and finally withdrew after achieving nothing. Patrol effectiveness dropped from an average of 2 ships sunk per patrol in early 1943 to fewer than half a ship per patrol by summer. Dönitz tried various countermeasures. He ordered submarines to stay surfaced and fight attacking aircraft with anti-aircraft guns. Several U-boats tried this. All were destroyed or crippled. Aircraft attacked from positions where submarine guns couldn't track them effectively. They dropped depth charges from low altitude, while submarine gunners were still trying to acquire targets. The exchange ratio was catastrophically bad. 10 U-boats damaged or sunk for every aircraft shot down. He ordered submarines to dive immediately when aircraft were detected, then surface 30 minutes later in a different location. Carrier groups adapted by coordinating multiple aircraft. When one aircraft forced a submarine to dive, A second aircraft would be waiting nearby when it resurfaced. The submarines couldn't escape. They were tracked continuously by aircraft working in relays. He tried concentrating U-boats in wolf packs, hoping that massed anti-aircraft fire would drive off attacking aircraft. Carrier groups brought more aircraft and attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Large submarine formations were easier to detect than individual boats. They presented better targets. By July 1943, Dönitz admitted in his war diary that escort carriers had fundamentally changed Atlantic warfare. He wrote that operations in the central and northern Atlantic were no longer feasible due to constant air surveillance. He withdrew U-boats from those areas and repositioned them to the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, where carrier coverage was less dense. The withdrawal was temporary. Allied escort carriers followed the U-boats wherever they went. By September 1943, hunter-killer groups were operating off the Azores, in the Caribbean, along the African coast, even near the Brazilian coast. There was no safe haven. Every ocean area where U-boats operated eventually saw escort carrier patrols. The hunter-killer groups refined their tactics throughout 1943. They developed coordinated search patterns where aircraft from the carrier worked with surface ships using sonar. When aircraft detected a submarine and forced it to dive, destroyers would close on the position and prosecute with depth charges. The submarine was trapped between air and surface threats. They learned to exploit U-boat communication protocols. German submarines reported positions and sightings via radio. Allied intelligence used high-frequency direction finding to locate transmitting submarines. The information was passed to nearby carrier groups, which would steam toward the last known position and launch aircraft. U-boats discovered that any radio transmission brought carrier aircraft within hours. Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding USS Guadalcanal's hunter-killer group, developed the most aggressive tactics. He positioned his group along known U-boat transit routes and waited. When the radio direction finding detected a submarine nearby, the Gallery would launch all available aircraft and send his destroyers to search at maximum speed. The group would maintain contact with the submarine for days if necessary, attacking repeatedly until it was destroyed. Gallery's group sank U-515 in April 1944 after a 30-hour pursuit. The submarine dove, evaded, resurfaced, dove again, tried every evasion tactic, but couldn't escape. Aircraft tracked it continuously. Every time it surfaced, another attack came. Eventually, the submarine's batteries were exhausted. It had to surface and couldn't dive again. Gallery's destroyers closed in and destroyed it with gunfire. In June 1944, Gallery achieved something unprecedented. His group detected U-505, surfaced in mid-Atlantic. Aircraft attacked and damaged the submarine before it could dive. Gallery ordered his destroyers to close rapidly, but not sink the U-boat. He wanted to capture it. Sailors from USS Pillsbury boarded the sinking submarine and prevented the crew from scuttling it. U-505 was towed to Bermuda, the only German U-boat captured on the high seas during the war. The capture was kept secret. Allied intelligence didn't want Germany to know they had an intact U-boat with its Enigma cipher machine and code books. The captured materials provided cryptographic intelligence that remained valuable until the end of the war. Gallery received the Distinguished Service Medal and his crew received commendations. The operation proved that escort carrier groups could do more than just sink submarines. They could capture them. By the end of 1944, escort carrier groups had established complete dominance over the Atlantic. U-boats couldn't operate effectively anywhere in the theater. The statistics were crushing. In 1943, before escort carriers became widespread, U-boats sank 3.9 million tons of Allied shipping in the Atlantic. In 1944, with dozens of hunter-killer groups operating, U-boats sank less than 500,000 tons. The collapse was total. German submarine construction continued throughout the war. Shipyards delivered new boats every week. Type 21 submarines, revolutionary designs with improved underwater performance and battery capacity, began entering service in late 1944. But it didn't matter. The infrastructure for operating submarines had been destroyed. Experienced crews were dead. Training facilities couldn't replace losses. New submarines sailed on first patrols with inexperienced crews and were sunk within weeks. The life expectancy of a U-boat in 1944 was less than 3 months from commissioning to destruction. Some boats never completed a single patrol. They were sunk in transit through the Bay of Biscay by aircraft from escort carriers specifically assigned to patrol those waters. The casualty rate among U-boat crews exceeded 75%. 3 out of 4 submariners died during the war. It was the highest fatality rate of any military branch in any nation during World War II. Dönitz continued ordering submarines to sea until May 1945. He never admitted that the campaign was lost. He believed that U-boats tied down Allied escort forces that would otherwise be used elsewhere. He believed that the submarine threat forced the Allies to maintain convoy systems and anti-submarine patrols. He was technically correct, but the cost was catastrophic. Thousands of trained submariners died in operations that achieved nothing strategic. The final U-boat was sunk on May 7, 1945, one day before Germany surrendered. U-320 was destroyed by aircraft from HMS Searcher, a British escort carrier, off the coast of Norway. The aircraft dropped acoustic homing torpedoes that tracked the submarine underwater and detonated against its hull. There were no survivors. Total losses tell the story. Between May 1943 and May 1945, escort carrier groups sank or participated in sinking 83 U-boats. They damaged 147 others severely enough to abort patrols. They forced hundreds of submarines to dive, evade, and waste time and fuel running from pursuers instead of attacking convoys. The operational impact was far larger than direct kills suggested. Convoy losses during the same period dropped to negligible levels. In the 18 months before escort carriers became widespread, U-boats sank an average of 40 merchant ships per month. In the 18 months after escort carriers deployed, losses dropped to fewer than 10 merchant ships per month. By early 1945, months would pass without a single merchant ship sunk in the North Atlantic. Admiral Dönitz was interrogated after the war by Allied intelligence officers. They asked him what development had been most devastating to U-boat operations. Dönitz listed several factors: improved Allied radar, better anti-submarine weapons, increased numbers of escort ships, closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap. But when pressed to identify the single most decisive factor, he hesitated, then said escort carriers. Dönitz explained that land-based aircraft were predictable. U-boats could avoid their patrol patterns. Surface escorts were limited to convoy routes. U-boats could attack from positions outside escort range. But escort carriers were mobile, unpredictable, persistent. They appeared anywhere, attacked without warning, and pursued submarines relentlessly. A U-boat commander never knew if a carrier group was nearby. The psychological pressure was enormous. Dönitz also admitted he had underestimated escort carrier effectiveness. He'd believed small carriers would be limited to coastal operations. He'd assumed they couldn't survive North Atlantic weather. He'd thought they were too vulnerable to submarine attack. Every assumption had been wrong. Escort carriers proved robust enough for Atlantic operations. They survived storms that would have crippled larger ships, and they were nearly impossible to attack because they were always surrounded by screening destroyers with excellent sonar. The interrogators asked if better German technology could have countered escort carriers. Dönitz said no. The Type 21 submarine, with its improved underwater speed and battery capacity, might have evaded carrier aircraft more effectively, but it came too late. Even if Type 21 boats had been available in large numbers by mid-1943, they would only have prolonged the campaign, not changed its outcome. Allied air superiority was absolute. No submarine could operate successfully when hostile aircraft could detect it at any moment. The final question was whether Dönitz would have deployed U-boats differently if he'd known about escort carrier effectiveness in early 1943. Dönitz answered honestly. He would have withdrawn submarines from the North Atlantic immediately. He would have redeployed them to distant waters where carrier coverage was sparse. He would have used them for mine-laying and special operations instead of convoy attacks. But he admitted those alternatives would have reduced the U-boat force to strategic irrelevance. The campaign would have ended either way. The story of escort carriers versus U-boats is a story about adaptation and institutional learning. The Allies identified a critical vulnerability, the mid-Atlantic air gap, and developed a solution, the escort carrier, that addressed the vulnerability directly. They built the carriers in enormous numbers using mass production techniques. They developed tactics that maximized carrier effectiveness. They refined those tactics based on operational experience. And they persisted despite initial losses until the system worked. Germany failed to adapt. Dönitz recognized that Allied air power was increasing, but he never grasped how fundamentally it had changed submarine warfare. He continued ordering U-boats to operate in areas where they couldn't survive. He developed countermeasures that didn't work and abandoned them too slowly. He never fully appreciated that technology had rendered his entire tactical doctrine obsolete. The human cost was terrible. 30,000 German submariners died. 5,000 Allied merchant seamen died after May 1943. Many in the final months of the war, when U-boats were achieving almost nothing. Hundreds of escort carrier crew members died in accidents and combat. The war at sea was brutal and unforgiving. But the strategic outcome was clear. Escort carriers destroyed the U-boat threat. They made convoy crossing safe. They enabled the buildup of forces in Britain for D-Day. They protected supply lines to the Soviet Union. They freed destroyers and other escort vessels for duty in other theaters. A technology that Admiral Dönitz dismissed as impractical had won the Battle of the Atlantic. Captain Peter-Erich Cremer survived the war. U-333 was sunk in July 1944 by depth charges from a Canadian frigate. Cremer and most of his crew escaped and were rescued. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. After the war, he wrote a memoir describing his experiences. He devoted an entire chapter to escort carriers. He called them the weapon that made U-boat operations impossible. He admitted he'd never understood their significance until it was too late. USS Bogug, the first American escort carrier to deploy as a hunter-killer, was decommissioned in 1946. She'd completed 12 patrols. Her aircraft had sunk 2 U-boats directly and participated in sinking 11 others. She'd protected dozens of convoys. She'd spent more days at sea than most destroyers. After the war, she was sold for scrap. Most escort carriers met the same fate. They'd been built cheaply for a specific mission. When the mission ended, they had no value. A few escort carriers were retained for special purposes. Several were converted to aircraft transports. One became Zeiss helicopter carrier. 2 were sold to the French Navy and served for another decade. But most were scrapped within 5 years of the war's end. They'd served their purpose. The technology moved on. By the 1950s, jet aircraft required longer flight decks and more powerful catapults. Escort carriers couldn't accommodate them. The tactical lessons endured. Carrier-based aircraft proved capable of finding and destroying submarines in ways that surface ships alone could not. The combination of air and surface assets, working together in coordinated hunter-killer groups, became the foundation of modern anti-submarine warfare. Every navy in the world adopted some version of the doctrine developed in the Atlantic between 1943 and 1945. The technological lessons were equally important. Centimetric radar, acoustic homing torpedoes, high-frequency direction finding, improved sonar, all came together in escort carrier operations. No single technology won the battle. The integration of multiple technologies employed by well-trained crews using proven tactics produced overwhelming superiority. That integration is now the standard for naval warfare. And the production lessons changed shipbuilding forever. Kaiser's mass production methods, building carriers from prefabricated sections in a matter of months, demonstrated what industrial capacity could achieve when properly organized. After the war, similar techniques were applied to merchant ship construction, naval vessel construction, even commercial aircraft production. The escort carrier program proved that speed and volume could overcome individual quality in certain contexts. Admiral Karl Dönitz became Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy in January 1943, replacing Grand Admiral Erich Raeder. He held that position until May 1945. During those 29 months, he sent more than 600 U-boats on patrol, fewer than 200 returned, over 20,000 submariners died under his command. The U-boat force fought until the last day of the war and accomplished almost nothing after mid-1943. Dönitz was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes. He was convicted of waging aggressive war and violating protocols regarding merchant ship attacks. He served 10 years in prison and was released in 1956. He lived until 1980, wrote memoirs defending his conduct, and never admitted that continuing U-boat operations after May 1943 had been futile. He maintained that submarines had tied down Allied resources and forced them to maintain convoy systems. Technically true, strategically meaningless. The escort carriers that defeated his submarines were forgotten within a decade. They were too small, too slow, too crude to compete with modern fleet carriers. But for 18 critical months, they'd been the most important naval vessels in the Atlantic. They'd closed the air gap. They'd hunted submarines relentlessly. They'd turned the Battle of the Atlantic from a desperate struggle into an Allied victory. Dönitz had dismissed them as propaganda, as exaggerations, as militarily insignificant. That dismissal cost Germany the Battle of the Atlantic. It cost the U-boat force its effectiveness. It cost 20,000 submariners their lives. And it demonstrated once again that wars are won by commanders who adapt to new realities faster than their opponents. Dönitz never adapted. The escort carriers won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.